YOLO composing gloves here, and in this first lesson of Sound and Synth Basics, we're going to be answering the question, what is sound? You've heard sounds your whole life, unless you're deaf, and you want to know what is sound. You're tired of never questioning this thing that's always around you. So what I want you to do is get out a paper, and I really want you to try and figure it out. What is sound? Try to define it. What makes sound a sound? Is it something you can hold? Obviously not. If you think that might be a little weird, but you gotta ask questions, you know? What is sound made of? What are the properties of this sound thing? And what I want you to do is really try and figure out what sound is, write it down on a paper, write down your observations, and then I want you to go and find someone and I want you to show them your findings before you watch this video. That way you've had an engaging discussion, and when you come back, hopefully I'll be able to add to your views or maybe modify some things you were confused about, or maybe even change your mind on certain things. And that's gonna make this a much more enriching experience. So don't deprive yourself. Start a Reddit thread and argue about it. Do something so that when you watch this, you get a little more out of it. So I'm assuming you've got your definition of sound sort of figured out. You've paused the video and went and tried it out. Now, a lot of people change their answer when I ask this question. It may have come up in your discussion. What is the difference between sound and a vibration? Because a lot of people have something along the lines of sound is a vibration. And sound, I don't like these kinds of definitions because it's saying sound and vibration are basically the same thing. Not necessarily the same thing, but it sure does sound like that, where we clearly know that sound is a specific case of a vibration. There's a difference. There's a reason why we call one a vibration and we call the other one a sound. So if you have something along that, go ahead, pause it, change it, really think about this real quick. So after people have heard this, usually the answer changes to something like sound is a vibration people can hear. Now this one is a lot better. This is totally much better, but it still falls a little short of this what is sound thing. Maybe you have something that's total overkill, like I haven't even scraped the surface of your definition. Maybe you're writing a book right now on acoustics, who knows? But I really want you to pause, really think about it. What is a sound? So my definition of sound is a pattern of vibrations through a medium perceived by an auditory system. Now, I'm going to be glossing over some details that I mentioned further in the book. So if you're looking for further information, or maybe I've received feedback and I've made the book a bit better than it was when I published this video. And so just so you know, some things you might be going, hey, there's more to it there. I'm leaving that to the book. That way I don't go too crazy here. So that's my definition of sound, which is a pattern of vibrations through a medium perceived by an auditory system. There's a couple parts. The first part is it's a pattern of vibrations. I'm separating the sound from the vibrations, saying that it's some sort of pattern of vibrations. It's not just random vibrations. Like it could be random vibrations, but that would be the pattern of the vibrations. Because we have things like speech, we have sounds like car doors closing, and we're really good at detecting things. Like you hear sounds and you figure out what it is pretty fast. And we say through a medium. And so what this means is sound has to go through maybe air or some water or some steel. It has to go through something for sound to be a thing. And it's perceived by an auditory system. Now this is like really fancy speak, but I just didn't want to like narrow down something really specific, like people or animals, like, I don't know, squirrels. I didn't want to get really specific. I wanted to be as general as possible. So I used the term auditory system. Google has their own definition, which I think is fine, but they're not as general, so I don't think it's as good. They say vibrations that travel through the air or another medium and can be heard when they reach a person's or animal's ear. So they like limit it to people and animals, which is a pretty good limitation, but at the same time, I don't know, maybe one day there'll be aliens, and now Google's definition excludes aliens. They're gonna have to update it. Mine will stand their test of time. But at the same time, these definitions of sound, as nice as they are, they have added a little bit of light to the subject. Like, okay, we've got vibrations that we're recognizing the patterns in them, and it's got to go through a medium, but we don't really have a sense of sound. Like, it's not as concrete as it could be. So let's ask another question and let's continue to whittle down on this. What is sound business? So my question to you is, if I'm playing a sound in a room and no one is there to hear it, is it a sound? It's the tree falling in the forest question. If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Pretty famous questions, very philosophical in nature, but there's an important takeaway, and this is why I'm bringing it up. So let's try and answer it. Now, there's a couple of views on this. In my philosophy course, I learned a bunch of different ones. And for a while, we studied what's called a theory of knowledge, which is like, how do you know something? Like, how do people get knowledge? How do you know if something's true? But it's like a little bit deeper than that. Like, it questions the very methods and fundamental beliefs to know that something's true. We're going to be going down the route of things exist even if you're not there to witness its existence. Like, for example, I'm in my room, I'm accepting that you exist even though I can't like see or hear you. I just believe you're there. Because it can get really freaking weird, and we're just gonna keep it on a ground level. Most people will find this reasoning very sensible, so we're gonna stay with this. But I just thought I'd toss it out there. If you want to know more, look up theory of knowledge. So if there is this thing playing in a room and no one was there to hear it, then by my definition, it would not be a sound. And instead, it would be a collection of vibrations. Now you might be going, why? Why would this be the case? Well, the reason this is the case is because no one is there to interpret the vibrations. We might be able to measure it, but no one heard it. And this is why it's not a sound. A similar problem is that of color. It's very popularly brought up. If you see a brown chair, but then look away, is it still brown? The answer is no, it's not still brown. It's still a chair because we accept that shape is independent of our observation. Like, it's gonna be the shape of a chair whether we are there looking at it saying like, oh, this is in the shape of a chair or not. But as far as color is concerned, it is now a chair. If you were measuring it with like scientific instruments but weren't directly looking at it, we would notice that it is now a chair that absorbs all but a particular light wave, which in our case is brown light. There's a famous Vsauce video called This Is Not Yellow that brings up the fact that he's holding a yellow object in a video, but your screen cannot produce the color yellow directly. It has to trick your brain. And so it's the interpretation that allows us to see yellow. And this is why color is an observed phenomenon. Similar to sound, sound is an observed phenomenon. And I say this because it gives itself to a very important understanding that's going to underlie everything you ever talk about whenever you're talking about sound. I'm not saying this to be all weird and philosophical. I'm saying this because it's a perspective that you must have if you're going to be successful in understanding the more abstract parts of sound. And that is, sound must be interpreted. No matter what you do, it's got to go through that thing between your ears for you to comprehend anything about sound. And so you need to know this because other people are going to interpret sound a bit differently than you. Humans do not hear sounds the same way. Like, we hear them very identically. Don't get me wrong, they're very close. But it's not exactly the same. We have different gear in our ears. Some people have better ears. Some people have big ears, small ears, ear canal lengths vary. All that stuff is mechanical and physiological. And when it gets to your brain, you have developed through your growing up different patterns of processing the neural impulses you're getting from your ears. And because of this, it's just not the same. So I say this because when I talk about sound, you need to take everything I'm saying here with a grain of salt. There's two things additionally I want to mention. The first one is when we take measurements of sound, we're not actually measuring sound. This is something that people will say though. They'll say this out loud, like, oh, this is how loud the sound is. When in reality, we are measuring the physical properties of compression waves. Just because a compression wave spikes really high, that doesn't mean it's going to sound really loud. It totally depends on a number of other factors. And so it's just really important. It's like a broader perspective we have in our background. The second is, this means opinion statements like louder is better is opinion-based, completely opinion-based. It has no scientific meaning. And when you're new, these are kind of useful, even though it sounds kind of bad, because you don't want to just accept what people are saying, but you need somewhere to start. And so people oftentimes, though, will misinterpret opinions for facts. And I've seen this to the point where people are so convinced that when they are presented with facts that directly contradict what they're claiming based on opinions, they won't listen to reason. It's like it was crazy. I've had it happen a couple of times on YouTube videos where I was like, this is just straight up incorrect. But anyways, that aside, just be aware of opinion statements. It's not bad though to take in opinions. A lot of times the majority of people have a particular opinion because in general, that's how people view the thing. So it is useful. Just be wary of people passing opinions for facts. Comes up all the time in like compression tutorials or like EQ tutorials. We just get into this gray area. So just be wary. So this has added to our understanding of sound. So now like, okay, we need to observe it. That's pretty clear now. Like it's not always the same. But what really is the sound thing? We know there's this physical portion because you probably heard that in space there is no sound. And you might be going, what's the deal with that? You may already have some idea of why that's true. So let's go ahead, sort of flush out this definition a little further. And also, from here on out, when I mention sound, we're assuming someone is there to hear it, and we're talking about vibrations. I only brought that up again just to sort of set the perspective. But moving on, sound is a set of waves, meaning that we have like light waves out there that you see. Well, you don't hear with your eyes, you hear with your ears. So there are certain waves that are specifically sound waves. And in our case, we happen to know that in general, they range from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And we'll clarify what that means in later lessons. But there's a specific range that we tend to hear well. And it varies from person to person. But these are the possible sound waves for humans. Now, when I say sound is a set of waves, I also mean that it is not a thing. It's a wave. And a wave isn't a thing in the same way like a speaker or a camera. You can hold those things in your hand, but sound isn't like that. But it does require things to exist. It's kind of weird. So remember in space, no one can hear you because, it's space. Well, on the earth, people can hear you. So whatever is on the earth, right? It obviously follows different rules. It has the things that are required for sound that space does not have. And a lot of you will already know it's because space is a vacuum. It has no medium in space. So let's consider something that you have a lot of experience with probably. If you haven't been there personally, I guarantee you've seen this thing in a movie. It's called the ocean. So consider the ocean. It's got waves, but if there were no water in the ocean, well, then there'd be no ocean. But so let's say there's no ocean, there's no water. Would there be waves? And you would say, no, because there's no water. How are you supposed to have waves without water? And be like, yeah, I vibe that. But what about the other way around? Could we have water and have no waves? And if you're a surfer, you're probably going, freak yeah, you can have that situation. So yes. And this is really important because if we can have water and have no waves, then what this means is that waves are a pattern in the water. It's not the water itself. And this is how sound works. Sound is a pattern in a medium, but it's not the medium in itself. In our ocean example, the water has a special name. The water is called a medium. A medium is the substance, in our case we're talking about water, that is necessary for the existence of these patterns, the waves. So we need a medium in order for a wave. And it's the same reason for sound. It's why you don't hear things in outer space, because there's no medium to transmit a wave. And because of that, we can't talk in space. Sound is a particular kind of wave. And this is really important to understand because the fact that it's a wave that we're built to detect means that we are in the process. So we have to interpret again. And because of this, what is sound to us may not be sound to something else. For example, dogs hear a lot higher than humans. And because of this, dog whistles are very painful to dogs, but they're not painful to humans. Another great example is even within just humans, some humans, especially older humans, typically have a harder time hearing the upper spectrum of sound. So they have a hard time hearing high frequencies. And so what some pubs and other stores are doing is if they don't want young kids messing around outside their store or coming in, they'll install little speakers that make these high frequencies old people can't hear, but young people can. And so the young people are like, this is a really annoying high frequency, and will leave, leaving the old people, which is what the store wants. Or maybe you've been in class and you have that friend that has that annoying ringtone that supposedly older people can't hear. But maybe you've got someone who's got a good set of ears and you're gonna get in trouble. But man, I remember always just telling that person with that higher frequency, freaking stop making that annoying noise. But anyways, that's besides the point. The point is we all hear sounds differently. Now they're very, very similar. It's usually not a problem. We hear very identically, but sometimes it becomes a problem. For example, if I'm in a room mixing and I'm with an older dude, so a lot of times the older mixing engineer will want to turn the high frequencies up. And that's usually not a good thing when you have it turned up as loud as they want to turn it up. And it's because they need to turn it up a lot more so they can hear it evenly, because they have a deficiency in the high frequencies where everyone else is going to hear just a super bright high and it's going to ruin the song. A classic example of like, hey, let's not do what you're saying because we hear things differently and more people are going to want to hear it like this. And then that old person might get some hearing aids that'll fix it for them personally or something. So the nature of studying the differences in sound from an interpretation perspective is a mix of fields of study. You'll find physiology, neuroscience, and psychoacoustics as fields of study that will often try and tackle problems and questions of this nature. But for us, it's important because just knowing that someone else interprets it differently and knowing that what's sound to us may not be sound to them can really open up doorways as far as being understanding and knowing how to react in a particular situation. So now that we know this, we sort of want some more info on this whole medium thing. What is, like, we've talked a bit about mediums, but it seems like there's more here that we are missing. And the answer is, yeah, we are missing stuff about mediums. So what could pass as a medium? And the answer is pretty much anything that's physical. So, for example, the big one we all know and love is air. You need it to live, you need it to hear, usually. But there's others. You could use water, and you could use mediums, even like steel, for example, could pass as a medium. Each medium will have different effects upon the sound, and some of them are actually used very creatively. Studios will often have what's called plate reverb, and this is literally a metal plate that you will run your signal into. And we're going to define what signal means later on a lot more clearly, but for now, we're just going to say music, but you're really running a signal into it. So you run your music through this metal plate, and the properties of this plate physically will alter your music. It will actually make it sound like it's in another room, and that's what we call it reverb. We're simulating the space and the reverb of another room. And so plate reverb is really cool. There's another one called spring reverb, which is the same thing, only instead of running it through a metal plate, you run it through a metal spring. And the properties of this metal spring will change the sound. And you've totally heard spring and plate reverb on your favorite tracks at some point. Spring reverb is commonly implemented in guitar amps. So, okay, we got these different mediums, but how do we know which medium to pick? Like, how would we know like what a particular medium would do to a sound? This seems like something that would be really important to know about, because when we go from place to place, the air is going to be different, right? Some air will be more moist, it'll be humid, some will be dry, some will be hot. Like, are these things important? And the answer is yes, it's very important. I'm gonna lay down a couple things that you need to know about mediums, but I'm also going to tell you we're mostly gonna ignore the sound source. So whatever is generating the sound can be like a whole topic all on its own. So for now, we're just gonna ignore that, and we're going to only talk about mediums. So there's two things that are really important, that if you know these two things, you can pretty much talk about the medium. There's others, but they're like way more detailed and hardly necessary for what we want to do. So the first one is density. So density is how tightly packed an object is. And the classic case of density is, let's say that you're like moving and you have two boxes. You have to pick up one of these boxes in order to move. And you have to go, okay, well, I've got this small box here, and that doesn't look that bad. But I've also got this big box here, and this big box, you know, it's kind of big. Big boxes tend to be heavier, so you go for the small box first. You try to pick up the small box and you're like, oh my gosh, what did I put in this little box? Because you can't lift it. It's so dang heavy, you can't lift it. So you're like, oh, well, how heavy is the big box? So you turn around and pick up the big box, and you find out you can pick up that big box with one hand. And so the difference between these two boxes is the density. One is more tightly packed. There's more stuff in that little box. That's why it's so heavy you can't pick it up. So it's not size, it's simply how packed in something is. Kind of an interesting thing. So you could have two little boxes that are the same size and one's easier to pick up than the other. It's because their density is different. So don't confuse size. Has nothing to do with size, has everything to do with how tightly packed something is. Now in sound, I'm going to give you a different example of density for sound. Just that's a good introduction to density, the box analogy. But for sound, I actually have a link in my book to a video of some dominoes where this is demonstrated. But if I had two sets of dominoes and one set of dominoes had like a lot of dominoes like right next to each other, like they're basically touching, and the other dominoes were spaced out like normal, and I were to start knocking, I started the knockover of these dominoes at the same time, well, the dominoes that are really closely packed together will actually get knocked over faster. The wave will travel through those dominoes really fast. The dominoes that are spread out will be slower because they're less dense. And so you would actually see the last domino fall over on the densely packed dominoes faster than the spread out ones. And so this is a really important understanding because it demonstrates something that's true with sound. Sound travels faster through dense material. So stuff like metal, it'll go through metal a lot faster than it will air. And the reason is metal is a solid and it's not a gas. And so it's a lot more packed together. And so since it's denser, sound will go through it faster. It's not as simple as this. I'm sort of oversimplifying a bit because sound is made of a spectrum, right? We have high frequencies, mid-range, and low end. We have these different frequency ranges. And in audio, we really care about preserving these frequency ranges. Well, for example, air will absorb high frequencies a lot. So low frequencies will get a lot further in air than high frequencies will. And part of it is because of the density. Because high frequencies are these tiny little waves, they struggle to get through less dense material. And so that's something you're just gonna notice with less dense stuff, is it will also act as a kind of filter. If you've ever built your own circuits, which if you have, you probably already know all this stuff, but if like a capacitor will take off the high end pretty easily because it's capacitor. Capacitor you can visualize as sort of spaced out dominoes, for those of you that know their electronics a little bit. So okay, that's density. Basically, denser means faster, and typically high end is preserved a bit better, and less dense is slower, and high end is lost a little bit quicker. Not always true, but usually true. Now, the second thing that I want to mention here for mediums is temperature. Temperature is the other thing that can really affect the speed of sound. So if something's hot, it's faster, and if it's slow, it's colder. I linked some videos in the book also that talk about this and how like one is like a really goofy animation, but basically that's really straightforward. So if you're in a hot desert, your sound is going to propagate faster, and if you're in like a cold freezing area, your sound will be slower. These can be important factors because when they get combined together, they can affect things like how fast your high frequencies are absorbed or how slow they're absorbed, how much further they'll get in one setting versus another. So they change how a space sounds. And as a beginner, you need to build up sort of an intuition, and you get that by just being in a lot of spaces and hearing what they sound like. But knowing this information allows you to deliberately listen for it, which is a huge leg up. You'll be able to pick up things much faster than discovering them by accident. Like, it's just gonna be way better. So density and temperature. Now, as I mentioned, there are other things we could add to this list, but they are not nearly as important as these two. So I'm only gonna mention the two. We will talk about things in future videos that sort of relate these things, which is when you have a couple mediums. Like what happens if I'm talking in air and then the pressure waves I create with my mouth meet the wall in my room, right? The wall is a different medium. So some of the sound will be absorbed, reflected, and refracted, and the amount of each one of these is going to be different depending on the material and a whole bunch of factors. So we'll talk about some of this in a much later video, but I want to mention here that there are other factors. There's a couple of them. This is just the beginning of acoustics. Like, I have books on this subject, several books on just acoustics, and it's really, really cool, but it is a little more technical. So if you're into that sort of a thing, you can go check out. Like, I have one that I totally recommend called The Master Handbook of Acoustics, an excellent book. Maybe overkill for most of you though. Plus, there's quite a bit of math involved with some of this, and I don't really want to start out with math in the series. I think that would just scare too many people away. So now we are going to establish a common number for the speed of sound, because as you just saw, there's a whole bunch of things that can affect the speed of sound. Well, namely two, density and temperature. So we need this just because you generally can get away with just using a ballpark figure, and you usually don't need super accurate numbers. So in general, we are going to use the figure that sound moves at 1130 feet per second. The reason is, this is the number I was taught when I went to school for this, as well as several books that I know use this figure. There was one book we had that used it was like 1122 feet, and they like specified temperature. They had this other deal going on. They had a different set of conditions. But most of the time, 1130 is the figure, feet per second that is, that I hear other people use. Sometimes you hear it in meters, but very rarely in my case. I almost always hear it in feet per second because we're in America. That's the figure I'm going to be using. It's the figure I'm going to have you use. It's a great figure, works for a lot of situations. It has good assumptions about room temperature, altitude, and because when I've tested it, it's always pretty much worked out. It'll get you close enough that you can make the tiny adjustments you need to just from hearing the results to get whatever it is you're looking for. So we're going to be using 1130 feet per second. A lot of other people use it. It's a great number. Now, to put it in perspective, just imagine yourself 1130 feet away, and if I were to yell at you like, hey, you would hear me yelling, hey, about a second later. And so that's it. So if we had a speaker out there, we'd want to put a 1 second delay on that speaker. That way, when someone talks from the origin of the sound source, 1130 feet away, they will sound like they go together. You won't hear like, hey, like you won't hear two heys, like this horrible delay. It'll be all together. It sound like one thing. And again, there are more accurate ways. We're assuming air temperature, density, all these things. And you could get a more accurate figure, but most of the time it's unnecessary and you're just wasting your time. 1130 feet per second will do you just fine. I do want to illuminate you a little bit further on the spectral change that can occur, because sometimes it can be pretty significant. So for example, if you're working like a nightclub, when people come in at the beginning, the nightclub is dry. It's usually not that hot yet. The air is going. And so when you start out your gig, you'll be playing and jamming and people are grooving. But as the night goes on, you're going to notice that the high frequencies will go up. The reason is there are more people. It's now a whole lot hotter, and the big kicker is it's gotten really sweaty and moist. And as the humidity goes up, the high frequency propagation will also go up, and it will cause a perceived increase in high frequencies. And so as the night goes on, you'll want to turn down the high end just a little bit, nothing like crazy, but you'll notice that it tends to come up as the night goes on. If you're performing outdoors, it's way less of a problem. It's also a big deal if you're going, maybe one night you're performing in a dry desert and the next day you're over somewhere in Florida where it's just mega humid, and you're just gonna notice a night and day difference between how the two places sound. And so the spectral change can be substantial. And if you've ever experienced it, it's kind of wild when you experience it for the first time, especially if it happens in the same night. If you've noticed it, like a big one, because it's just like, holy cow, this is crazy. Like maybe you started out in the middle of the day and it was just super hot and dry and it just sucked. And then it got freezing later at night and it got like more moist or something. You'll notice a pretty big change. And I always find it pretty cool because I'm just like, man, this is wild. I work live sound, so every now and then I'm just like, sound is so crazy just sitting there thinking about sound. So let's talk about what sound looks like. Now, sound is a three-dimensional phenomenon. I picture sort of like holographic bubbles coming out of people's mouths when I think of sound, because it's bouncing off of all these surfaces. It's got to move in the X, Y, and Z direction. So because of this, it sounds really complicated to try and visualize. But we have a number of ways to do this in 2 dimensions, and some people use color to try and capture the third. And there's a number of things we could measure. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot more later, but I just want to start getting you familiar with the graphs of sound and what its propagation looks like. So what I mean by propagation is how sound moves forward. So the first thing is we're going to be talking about air mostly. Air particles do not move with the wave. They move back and forth. When we talk about sound, you'll see this in a two-dimensional way, but it's actually like way more complicated because it's in 3 dimensions. It's called a longitudinal wave because the particles move in the same direction as they oscillate, meaning they move back and forth in the same direction as the compression waves propagate. Throwing at you a lot of terms I haven't defined, but what I want you to do is just look up some GIFs on Google, and this is actually one of the exercises, and simply draw some explanations on how sound propagates. Some of them even show particles moving. Some of them show them moving in the circular path, which is really good because it's kind of more of a 3-dimensional thing, which is what we want. Some of them show them moving back and forth in a straight line, which is like kind of how it happens, but it's not quite because we're talking about 3D space. Just getting an intuition and just looking at pictures, especially like little animated GIFs, can just be very enlightening to gaining multiple perspectives. And keep in mind that each one of them, since it's a 2D rendering, unless it's like made as a 3-dimensional kind of thing, it's going to be missing a piece of the picture. So the first exercise is to find 3 of these and to write down what each one shows and what you can learn from each one, because each one should be different enough that you draw a different conclusion. And I have my example in the answer key so you can see what I did if you're like really struggling for an explanation of or an example of what I mean. So now you should have a pretty solid understanding of sound in general. We could always get more specific, and that's what all the different branches of sound are for. But let's go ahead and do a quick recap. So you started with what you thought sound was. Maybe you nailed everything I said in this video, which is excellent for you. And as we broke it down, we differentiated the difference between sound and a vibration. We also talked about how sound must be perceived, and because of that, we all hear differently. It's not the same thing as a vibration. We talked about the different mediums, and how a medium is not the sound itself, but sound requires a medium in order to be heard. That's why you can't hear things in space, or talk in space, or anything else that has to do with sound in space. But it also explains things like why metal sounds like a reverb. It's because of its properties as a medium. We talked about some of the things that make a medium behave like it does. For example, we talked about density, and we also talked about temperature and how these things can have impacts on spaces. We talked about how in some spaces, because of the medium, our high frequencies may behave differently. These are typically the frequencies that are affected the most because they're small frequencies, so high frequencies are easy targets. We also briefly talked about propagation of sound, and that is a topic we will be going much further into a little bit later, and just getting an intuition about sound. So hopefully you found this video enlightening. If so, comment in the description what your favorite part was, what blew your mind the most, or maybe what your original definition of sound was and how on the dot you were about getting it right, or maybe how off the mark you were. I also want to leave you with this really cool fact. We actually use vibrations to measure the temperature of the ocean on like a macroscopic scale. So like ocean climate, this is one method we use to measure it. And what happens is, I read this in the Master Handbook of Acoustics, and it just blew my mind, I have to tell you. So what they do is they put a charge down in the water at some specific depth where waves propagate a lot further than usual. And this is because of several properties of water as a medium, and also has to do with temperature. So they detonate this charge down in the ocean, and because the wave goes a lot further than usual, and we understand this really well, if the wave changes how far it goes, or it might be amplitude, I can't completely remember, but basically the wave will indicate if the temperature has changed because we know all the other factors. So based on the behavior of the wave, we're able to determine if the temperature of the ocean has changed. Go ahead, check it out. But just a really cool aside. So go ahead, check out the exercises that are in here. I have 6 questions. The first one's that exercise that I already sort of talked about. I also include the answer document so you can see the answers. If you have any questions, let me know. Support me on Patreon because that is a massive help and will help produce more of these in the future. Subscribe and have a blessed day.